there is a Jewish concept called to be mezakeh harabim, to bring merit to multitudes of people, to give more and more opportunity to more and more people to grow in soul and to study Torah. You know, when technology started developing in the 20th century, some people were taken aback. They were thinking about what it could do to human relationships. They were right. We're stuck in our screens, right? But there were people who realized, especially in the Hasidic world, like the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that technology, like everything in life, is a double-edged sword. We can use it in order to elevate our souls and to enhance the lives of others, or we can use it for denigration, God forbid. So, you know, the Lubavitcher Rebbe immediately thought, okay, radio is a great tool to share Torah. So today we have literally the whole world at our fingertips, right? That's the internet's revolution. The entirety of all knowledge and genius compiled by previous generations to our time is literally at our fingertips. So, God willing, more opportunity people might have to learn with us, and this is actually a very special time to start this, because the Torah portion that we are learning and that we are connecting to its spiritual energy this Shabbat is that of parshat Yitro. And there are several things to say about that. In many ways, you could say that this week's parsha is, to use a bombastic term, the culmination of the Jewish vocation. What does it mean? It means that this is what it's all about. I don't know if you've seen the movie with Robert De Niro, The Deer Hunter. There's a moment in the movie where De Niro says, "This is this. This ain't something else. This is this." So this is this. This is what the Jewish people was fashioned for. From a Jewish spiritual perspective, that's the telos, the objective, the purpose of creation. If you go back to the first Torah portion of Bereshit, Hashem says, God says in the plural, Na'aseh Adam betzalmeinu kidmutenu. Let us fashion a human being in our likeness and in our image. And some of the commentators, the rabbis, are perplexed. And they ask themselves, hold on, why is God speaking in the plural? Why is he saying, let us fashion a human being? Why is he saying, let me finish? The answer is that God is being humble, right? So he's talking to the angels, allegorically speaking. Of course, God is abstract and spiritual and not tangible and corporeal. God doesn't have a mouth, and doesn't have a mouth, doesn't speak. But allegorically, God is saying that. And the whole purpose of creation is to, well, everything in creation has its place and legitimacy and sanctity, but at the end of the day, a human being is unique because we are endowed with a spiritual perspective. There was a great 20th century French novelist and essayist, Albert Camus. I wrote a book about him and part of my doctorate. And he writes in one of his books, The Myth of Sisyphus, he says, a tree doesn't contemplate the essence of treeness. What does it mean to be a tree? A cat doesn't contemplate the essence of cat. Only a human being thinks about the meaning of their lives. According to Viktor Frankl, a Jew who survived Auschwitz, and he founded a new psychological school called logotherapy, we are the meaning-seeking animal. That's why the Torah says, man does not live by bread alone, right? I know some people who can live on sushi and Greek salad, man, or human beings don't live by bread alone, right? So we need something greater in our lives, and what we get in this Torah portion is the mission statement of the Jewish people, our role that God has assigned to us to play in this world. They say in French, chaque vent a son destin. Every spirit has its destiny. And in this Torah portion, we read what is the Jewish destiny, what is the Jewish calling. That's one thing. Secondly, we're reading the second book of the Torah, Exodus, like exiting from Egypt. And I call this book, the book of Shemot, Genesis, the book of freedom. We undergo what we call in political science nation building, right? We emerged, we came into Egypt after the Dow Jones collapsed in Israel. There was a famine in the land, there was an economic crisis. We moved to Egypt. And in Egypt, we became subjugated and enslaved and dehumanized. And for centuries, according to the literal text of the Torah, and for less than 200 years, according to Rashi and the commentators. But the bottom line is, having left Egypt 2 Shabbats ago in Parshat Bo, and having traversed the Red Sea and saw the world's greatest empire vanish and be vanquished unto oblivion, we spoke last week about the fact that the splitting of the Red Sea, on the face of it, a nice story that kids can watch if they watch the movie The Prince of Egypt. The deeper meaning of this story is that many world empires tried to eradicate and annihilate the Jewish people, and later on the Assyrian Empire and many other empires, culminating in Nazism and Stalinism in the 20th century, and they all ended up drowning in the stormy seas of geopolitics, and now they're relegated to the history books, and the Jewish people defies historical gravity and continues. So now we are politically free, right? We crossed the Red Sea and we're safe. The Egyptian army is gone. We sang the song upon the splitting of the sea, we thank God. So now we're politically free. Comes the Torah this week, this Shabbat, this Torah portion of the Torah, and says, that's great, but political freedom, in academic language, one might say, is necessary but not sufficient. Just like money, right? The sages say, "En kemach en Torah." If there is no flour, flour is an Flour. If we don't have a certain basic threshold of material possessions, then we can't move on to the next rung to refine our souls, right? Some of us are familiar with the Jewish American psychologist Abraham Maslow, who was part of the School of Humanistic Psychology, and he conceptualized a thing called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We have basic needs like food and sustenance, and then we climb up the needs. It's like a pyramid, ultimately to realizing our God-given potential. The same thing as a nation. To have political freedom, to have independence from foreign rule, that's a great stepping stone, but it's not enough. Let me give you one more outside worldly reference before we plunge ourselves into the Torah text specifically. There was a great political theorist, political philosopher in the 20th century called Isaiah Berlin, Jewish, from Latvia. Thank God his parents moved to England when he was a kid, before the Holocaust. And he became one of the great political theorists, those who write about the great political minds and philosophers. He was at Oxford University. By the way, he was close with Rabbi Sachs, whom we hosted 3 weeks ago. And Sachs, at some point, Rabbi Sachs became his rabbi and also officiated his funeral. And I think Isaiah Berlin, Professor Berlin, once asked Rabbi Sachs, "I don't understand how a man of your towering intelligence can be religiously observant." So Rabbi Sachs told him, "Think of me as a lapsed heretic." Also, Isaiah Berlin said to Rabbi Sachs, when it comes to God, I'm tone deaf, which means he doesn't hear the music. What does that mean? You know, we're going to read in the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, a little later on, please God, that Moses experienced an epiphany, a revelation from God, in the tent of meeting. Now, a tent has a very thin fabric. The sages ask, how come the other guys didn't hear, the other people outside the tent didn't hear? So obviously God doesn't have a voice. It's an internal spiritual meditative state. But the deeper answer is that in order to be sensitized to God's presence in the world, we have to cultivate what Chicago scholar of Jewish studies, Professor Michael Fishbane, calls in one of his books sacred attunement. We have to develop an inner ear, if you like, to the underlying monistic unity of being, how about everything in the world is interconnected. Now we see our world, planet Earth, from the infinity of outer space. We see how we're all connected in our world, and you have to develop an eye and an ear for that in order to appreciate it.
In the world, would that be instinct as well? When you hear, I should do this, I shouldn't do it.
Well, that's what another philosopher called Heidegger called the call of conscience. Deep inside, we all know what's true and what's not so true. We just had a bar mitzvah service downstairs because we believe that there comes a time, not that late in human consciousness and understanding, we understand the basic paradigms. Going back to Isaiah Berlin, he wrote this article called Two Concepts of Freedom. Okay? Two concepts of liberty. One is freedom from. Don't tell me what to do. I want to be free. I want to be me. That's the American individual ethos of freedom that we celebrate and appreciate as proud Americans. Right? That's one facet of freedom. That you get to be the architect of your own inner structure, your own soul. You get to be the author of your own life story. Freedom from external coercion. Nobody's going to tell you, you're going to be religious, you're not going to be religious, you're going to live in the West Coast, the East Coast. That's one thing. The second thing is that also we have freedom to be. What is freedom to be? Freedom to be is freedom to become the highest, most refined, evolved version of ourselves, to tap into a large measure of our God-given potential. That is the idea of freedom to be. And that's what's happening in this parsha. God is telling us, I am summoning you to greatness. I want you to be a mamlechet kohanim vegoy kadosh. Which literally means, I want you to be a kingdom of priests. Every one of you should be a religious leader. We have here the democratization of the spiritual experience. Later on in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is going to say in the name of God rhetorically, Hanishma kadavar hazeh. Did you guys ever hear of such a thing? An entire nation saw God's presence. That is pretty unorthodox and exceptional in world religious narratives. In most spiritual doctrines, there was one godly person who merited a very close, intimate relationship with the divine, and he reported to everybody else. But here, the entire nation gathered around Mount Sinai and heard, according to some commentators, the first commandment, some only the first word of the first commandment. They couldn't withstand the sheer intensity of God's presence. But we were all there, spiritually speaking. Right? So we got our mission statement, and the human condition, humanity is getting a message to have political freedom and basic socioeconomic necessities is an incredible thing. There are still billions of people in the world who dream of that, both socioeconomic basic necessities and living in a democratic and open society. But the Torah is saying that's not enough. You also have to carve out your own spiritual freedom. And spiritual freedom is actually superior to political freedom, because there are people who can live in a place like America with wonderful political freedom, but internally, emotionally, mentally, they're stuck, they're stagnated. And there are people who live under very oppressive regimes, or lived historically, and were able to carve out their spiritual freedom under the most adverse of circumstances. Even in the Nazi concentration camps, they were spiritually, emotionally, mentally free. Right? So we get our mission statement as a people. But another thing I want to say is that this Torah portion is named after a person. Yitro, In English, Jethro. Now, there was a rock band in England back in the 80s called Jethro's Tull, I think. Right? It's a combination of my first name, Tull, and Jethro. Who was Jethro? Jethro was Moses' father-in-law. That's a big deal. He gets a Torah portion named after him. Abraham didn't get that. Isaac and Jacob didn't get that. Joseph didn't get that. Moses didn't get that. Some people did, right? Noach, we have a portion named after him. We have Yitro. We're going to have Pinchas, Balak, Bilam. We're going to have some people. And it means something. If you have a Torah portion named after you, it means that your life story has an important teaching for the Jewish people and for humanity. So, why does Jethro merit a Torah portion named after him? Now, first of all, Rashi tells us in his commentaries that Moses was a seeker. Maybe he wasn't a seek. Maybe he was a seek at some point, but he was a seeker. And Rashi says that Jethro experimented with all the different kinds of idolatries and spiritualities that were up for grabs in the ancient Near East, and ultimately he came to truth. He found Judaism, he found monotheism. Now it's very interesting. According to many commentators, Jethro ended up converting to Judaism, and he immersed himself in the mikveh in Pico. But according to some rabbis, he didn't necessarily become Jewish. He became a monotheist. According to, for example, Ibn Ezra, a great Spanish commentator and master grammarian. So first of all, a monotheist, but not necessarily a full-fledged Jew. Now, Jethro has a portion named after him because it shows us, it says in the Bible, in the book of Proverbs, Mishlei, the following, attributed to King Solomon, the historical figure before he became an hotel in Eilat. King Solomon says, Im tevakshena kekesef v'chematun. If you seek Torah, truth, meaning, spirituality, godliness, growth in soul, spiritual and ethical refinement, the way other people chase the dollar or are concerned with how they look physically, then you'll find it. So that's something that we can learn and must learn and should learn from Jethro. That if we make it our top priority in business and life to grow in soul, then we will achieve that. We will find the truth. And we will find true fulfillment and joy. That's what the Bible stipulates. And Jethro found that. He went through all the different life philosophies, if you like. So that's one thing. That's why the Torah portion is named after him, in which we get the 10 Commandments, the Torah. That's a big deal, right? Second thing is, Jethro is a non-Jew. What is the message here? You know, Rabbi Sachs observes something very important. The Torah moves from the universal to the particular. What does that mean? Torah starts in Genesis with Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were not Jewish, right? Only in the third Torah portion, Abraham and Sarah, we have the first Jewish couple, the first Jewish family, and ultimately the Jewish people comes into being. It comes to teach us what Rabbi Sachs calls the universality of justice. Torah says in its opening chapter, we're all created in God's image. We all have non-negotiable intrinsic human dignity and incalculable worth. The Torah makes that statement, the most revolutionary idea in the history of ideas, that we're all created in God's image. That is the precursor ultimately for modern day representative democracy and human rights. The process starts philosophically, politically, morally there. When the Torah stipulates thousands of years ago, in a world of absolute monarchs and despots, that we're all equal before God. That's a very revolutionary statement, right? So the Torah starts with universal human dignity. We're all in the divine, and then moved on to the Jewish story. So the universality of justice and the particularity of love basically means this. We have affection and respect and solidarity with all of humanity. Right? It's like the great English mystical poem. John Donne wrote a famous poem, For Whom the Bell Tolls. He says, no man is an island. We're all connected to all of humanity. Don't ask for whom the bell tolls. If the bell rings that somebody dies in your village, you're also diminished because you're part of the overall human landscape. But on the other hand, there is the particularity of love. Bless you. If you have a sibling or a parent or a child, then you love them more than you love somebody you never met who lives in Chicago or in China. And if you have a neighbor who has a sick relative, maybe you'll help out a little, give $100. But if it's your own child, you'll sell your own home if you need. It's just the way it is. There's the particularity of love and the universality of justice. And that's why the Torah is telling us, even when we get our specific mission statement as the Jewish people, to proliferate God's word to the world. Right? The Hebrew Bible is our story. It's written in Hebrew. But now billions of people accept it as God's word. That has been our mission throughout history, to spread the word, God's word. But everybody has a role to play in this world. And everybody is prized by God. There is another Torah portion, and that's why it's named, the Torah portion in which we receive the Torah is named after a non-Jew. What's the Torah holiday in which we celebrate the giving of the Torah and the commandments? Shavuot. And in Shavuot we read the book of Ruth. Ruth also grew up not Jewish. Later on she converted. Again, it's like we're getting a little poke. Remember, you're also part of the great human story. One final example is in the book of Leviticus, which is the book of holiness. We get the holiness code in Judaism, parshat kedoshim. Be holy, be distinct, be distinguished, because I, God, am holy. So walk in my ways. What did the rabbis, our sages of old of antiquity, choose for us as the parallel prophetic reading, the Haftarah, to be read when we read Parashat Kedoshim about the holiness code for the Jewish people? It's from the prophet Amos, who was a great social prophet 3,000 years ago. And he says, what's the opening words of that Haftarah? Unbelievable. The prophet Amos says in the name of God, Halo kivnei kushim atem li. What does that mean in English? You are as Africans to me. Africans, people from Africa. It doesn't matter to me what ethnicity one is. All of humanity is precious in God's eyes. So I see it as a humbling statement. Remember, God created the entire world, all living beings, and all of humanity, and everybody has a great role to play in this world as individuals and as distinct cultures. And because we're all different, each one of us can make a unique contribution, teaches Rabbi Sachs in his book, The Dignity of Difference. Let's jump in. Parshat Yitro, page 345 in the Jewish book. Okay. Vayishma ito, and Jethro heard. He received a voicemail. He was Moses' father-in-law. He heard everything that God perpetrated to Moses and his people, that he took them out in a very formidable and wondrous way out of Egypt. Rashi says, let me tell you exactly what Jethro heard. He heard about the splitting of the sea and the war with Amalek, that we won that war, which was at the end of last week's Torah portion. Verse 2. So Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Tzipporah, his daughter, who is Moses' wife, after she had been sent away. I guess Rashi is going to say things were tricky and very volatile in Egypt. So Tzipporah stayed with her father. And who else did Jethro bring with him to catch up with Moses and the Jewish people? On verse 3, Moses' two sons, Gershom, in verse 3, and Eliezer in verse 4. So I want to make a footnote. Judaism is the invention of meritocracy. What does meritocracy mean? From the word merit. If you merit it, you get it. If you don't merit it, you don't get it. Right? Joseph became the most powerful person in ancient Egypt, but he was a slave. And then he was a prisoner in jail. He earned it through his genius and hard work. The Torah brings to the world the notion of meritocracy, right? Have you seen the movie Back to the Future? It says in that movie, if you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything. That starts with the Torah, right? Joseph. Now, Moses' two sons, they're mentioned by name in passing in the Torah, but we don't know, the Torah really doesn't say anything about their character, what was their position, what was their role in society, and also they didn't end up taking leading roles. Not both Moses' sons, they didn't take on the mantle of leadership. Joshua did, right? It comes to teach us Judaism is a meritocracy. Okay? Now, the first name of the first son of Moses is Gershom. Gershom. I was a stranger there, right? I was a stranger in a foreign land. Moses remembers his humble beginnings, where he ran for his life to Midian because there was a warrant for his execution, right? He ran for his life. So he remembers those dark days. It gives him perspective. Think about your lives, especially those of us who are immigrants. The early days in America, the struggle, the cultural estrangement, the financial struggles, the emotional struggles, right? So, basically, Moses is teaching us you have to remember those times of adversity. Cultivate humility and gratitude. And then his second son, he calls him Eliezer. God helped me. It's all because of God. There's parshat Miketz, when Pharaoh has these nagging dreams and he's tormented by them, and he's being told there is a guy in prison called Joseph, and he's a Hebrew from Canaan, and he has genius in solving dreams. So he's summoned to the Pharaoh, they shave him up, they put on an Armani suit, he takes a shower, he comes to the palace, and Pharaoh tells him, I heard you're an ingenious dream interpreter. What does Joseph say to Pharaoh? Elohim. God solves dreams. Now tell me your dream, maybe I'll be able to help you out. Right? That's the humility that great people have, including here Moses saying, it's from God's help. So on verse 5, we're being told that Asher hu chonesham hara Elokim, that we were encamped as a nation facing Mount Sinai. And he's being told that, Moses is being told that Jethro is coming in a Tesla, in a new car, and Jethro comes out of the Tesla and they hug and they kiss. That's verse 7. On verse 8, Moses tells Jethro everything that he underwent and all the trials and tribulations. And Jethro, in verse 9, is thrilled to hear about all the great things that God did for the Jewish people. That is the first aliyah for this Shabbat's Torah reading. The second aliyah is on page 13, which is the very last part of our page. And the next day, what's going to happen, I'm going to expedite so that we can cover as much text ground as we can. What happens in the second aliyah, it says in verse 13, Moses was Judge Judy. He was the judge. Just kidding. But he was the only game in town. Whenever there was a disputation, civil law, people came to Moses. And Moses was the only one who was steeped and proficient and well-versed in the minutiae and intricacies of the law. So there were no other judges. Jethro was concerned that Moses is going to be burnt out. On verse 14, Jethro tells Moses, "Ma hadavar hazeh asher ata oseh la'am?" What are you doing to this people? Madua tashev levadcha? You're running the show solitary? You're running solo? And Moses says to his defense in verse 16, Ki elaim davar ba'elai. If they have an issue, come to me. I judge between them because I made known God's laws. Jethro says, that's not very good. Lo tov hadavar. That's not good. First of all, it's not good politically, judicially, that one person carries so much power, right? We need separations of powers. The judiciary, the legislative, the political, starts with Judaism. In antiquity, we had the king and the high priest, Kohen Gadol. We had the chief rabbi and the prime minister. Can't be both. You know, Europe got to that in 1748. There was a French philosopher called Charles Montesquieu. He wrote a book called L'Esprit des Lois, The Spirit of the Laws. And there he says, the president, you need to have a political branch, executive branch, and judicial. This is the origins of that. You start saying here. Yitro is saying, you need judges, right? You need judges. Now these judges, they need to be people of great ethical stature. Verse 21, the Torah is saying, Jethro is a non-Jew, is teaching Moses what are the moral qualities that we need for judges. Okay, verse 21. You will behold from the people Anshei Chayil. It's really people who excel, people who are above and beyond. Irei Elokim, people who revere God. You know, when we start the morning service with the Siddur means arrangement. Our meditation is worked out for us. One of the first verses after Modeani, after we thank, before we think, we say it's from the book of Proverbs in the Bible attributed to King Solomon. Reshit Chochma Yirat Hashem. The beginning of wisdom is fear of God. What is fear of God? Fear of God is having a conscience. Remember when Abram went to a place called Gerar, it was a very corrupt place, and Sarah was a very beautiful woman. So he told her, say you're my sister, otherwise some crazy person might kill you, might kill me to take you. And then Avimelech, who was a wonderful guy, tells Abraham, what did you think you were doing telling us this tall tale that Sarah is your sister? So Abraham says to his defense, Lo yadati, I didn't know if there is fear of God in this place. Fear of God is having a conscience. You know, it's a certain level that a person feels guilty if they did something that is not the right thing to do, that is wrongful, right? So we need people who have fear of God. You know, they say, fear of God means that we have a conscience, that it's gonna, something is gonna bug me if I did something wrong. If somebody dropped $100 bill on the floor and I, God forbid, would pick it up, put it in my pocket and not tell that person, if I have fear of God, it means it's gonna nudge me. I'm gonna feel bad about it. I'm gonna feel guilty. I'm gonna feel I messed up in a moment of weakness. I'm gonna feel like I did something wrong. That's what it means. Okay? Now, Anshei Emet, people of truth, they look for what the law really says. They don't care that the person who's standing trial does business with their cousin, and maybe this could be really good for their son to get an internship in somebody's office. They don't care. They have no angles. They're interested in truth, right? The relentless pursuit of truth, right? The sages say, allegorically speaking, in the Midrash, does God have a stamped seal? Allegorically speaking, the answer is yes. What is God's stamped seal? The word emet, truth, right? And that's when we finish saying the Shema. We have 3 paragraphs. The last one, parshat Tzitzit, is taken from the Torah portion of Shlach. And what do we say at the end? I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. Ani Hashem Elokechem. Emet. Right? My business card says truth on it. Sonei Vetza. People who hate greed. That's awesome. People who hate greed. By the way, the Bible also says in Ecclesiastes, in Kohelet, a lover of money shall never be satiated with money. Notice the Torah doesn't say a person who wants to make money, a person who's economically driven, a person who has entrepreneurial skills and wants to run with them and develop them. The Judaism doesn't have an aversion to wealth. Abram, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Rabbi Judah the Prince, who is the editor of the Mishnah, they were all self-made, affluent people. But they gave back to the community, to humanity. Right? So if you have a God-given gift, you should run with it, whatever that gift is. But don't love money. Don't have an emotional attachment to money. That will destroy you and corrupt you internally. So people who hate greed, they want to do well for themselves. They want to have a good income. Right? There's nothing wrong with that. But greed, emotional attachment to money, that's something they despise. Right? And you should appoint over these leaders, they should over thousands of people, hundreds of people, right? So you're going to have judicial hierarchies, right? Over different amount of people, right? Just like we have the circuit court and ultimately we have the Supreme Court, that sort of thing, right? And verse 22, the last two words in Hebrew is Venasu itach. They will share the burden with you. That is the second aliyah for this week's Torah portion. The third one, verse 24, is at the bottom of page 347, and it says the following verse. Well, that's a very, very short aliyah. It says that Moses heeded Jethro's advice to him, right? And it just shows you also the power of tshuva, the power of self-transformation. Jethro spent decades of his life in the dark, experimenting with all kinds of very corrupt and non-life enhancing philosophies. But ultimately he found the truth, he attached himself to the truth, he was enlightened, and he gave advice and illumination to Moses. And he taught us, the Jewish people, how to practice justice practically. And that teaches us something very important. It's never too late. How old was Abraham when he heard a cosmic divine call, which was also the inner voice of his soul, telling him, I want you to grow in soul, and I want you to start on a journey. The geopolitical journey is just the external facade. I want you to start the journey of monotheism for humanity. Abraham was 75 years old. 75 years old. You know, people can always change. I'll give you a story from my family. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was a very assertive businessman. And even when his kids were in their 40s or even 50s, he really tried to tell them, okay, this is what you should do in the business. This is what you should do. At some point, when my grandfather was much older, you know, I finished my first year in college in philosophy, and I got into the law school at the University College London. Together with Cambridge, it's the leading law school in England. I didn't really want to go to law school. I wanted to do philosophy. But I thought I'll ask my grandfather's advice, since he was a smart person with a lot of life wisdom and experience. So we're having lunch at his home. I'm saying, Grandpa, what should I do? Should I continue with philosophy or go to law? And my grandfather was a very practical man. He was a businessman. I was sure he's going to say, no question, philosophy, go study law, become a lawyer, make a buck. He looks at me and he says to me, I'll never forget it. Usually we spoke in Hebrew, but here he told me in English, you live your own life. Couldn't believe it. I told my parent, you know what Grandpa said? My mother couldn't believe it. For somebody who was always trying to be in control, for the good, out of love, learning that that's not the way. You got to let, like Rabbi Sachs was teaching us 3 weeks ago, when I asked him about parenting, he said, you have to model to your children the right and honorable path and hope that they will follow. But you can't make them. If you do, they will rebel, or they'll just follow you thoughtlessly, without depth, right? So, it's never too late. It wasn't too late for Jethro. It wasn't too late for Abraham and Sarah. It wasn't too late for my grandfather. And who else? Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest rabbis who ever lived in the 1st and 2nd century. He wanted to marry a woman called Rachel, and she loved him too. They wanted to get married. They were going to get married at Beverly Hilton right here with a Glad kosher caterer. But Rachel's father said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you my blessing because you can't even read the Aleph Bet. You can't even read the ABC. And I don't want, respectfully, my daughter and the father of my grandchildren to be somebody who is illiterate. Rabbi Akiva made it his business at the age of 40 to start learning how to read Hebrew. That's what he did, 18 hours a day, for many years on end. And he became the greatest sage of his time and one of the greatest rabbis of all time. Right? And so it comes to teach us. There are people like Jethro and Ruth. Jethro may never have become Jewish, but he was a great model to follow. Ruth became Jewish later. Right? Rabbi Akiva didn't have Torah knowledge until he was 4. It's never too late. There's a beautiful teaching in the Talmud. It says, Yafa sha'a achat shel Torah u'ma'asim tovim mikol chayei ha'olam haba. Even a relatively short chapter in one's life that's replete with spirituality and humanistic deeds, Torah and ma'asim tovim, than an eternity of time that we sit idly by and we don't do it. It's a very, very interesting perspective. So it's never too late. That's another thing to learn. Now, for all of us, the 4th Torah portion is also very short. It's on page 349, chapter 19. On the 3rd month, remember back then the 1st month was Nisan. Today it's the 7th month. Imagine like July used to be the 1st month in the Gregorian calendar and now it's January, right? So on the 3rd month, that would be Nisan, Iyar, Sivan. Right? And why did we get out of Passover in Nisan? Because we were driving a Nissan car. Right? Nisan, Sivan, Iyar. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan. On Sivan, the 3rd month that we came out of Egypt, we arrived at the Sinai desert and we stayed at the Hilton Taba in Sharm el-Sheikh. Verse 2. We drove in Teslas maybe, from a place called Refidim to meet the Sinai desert. And we parked there. Parking wasn't expensive back then. We encamped as a people in tents, facing the mountain. We parked there, facing the mountain. Now, here is an ingenious Rashi. Rashi, of course, was the greatest Torah commentator who ever lived. Once there was an English philosopher called Alfred Whitehead. I guess he had white hair or something. And Whitehead said that all of Western philosophy is a footnote on Plato's Republic. Meaning that Plato's Republic, a work that was written about 2,500 years ago, all the rest of Western philosophy somewhere or another corresponds with Plato's Republic. Same thing with Rashi. Rashi lived almost 1,000 years ago. All the great Torah minds who came after Rashi either endorse or challenge Rashi. And Rashi always has a question. He sees something in the Torah text that bothers him, that he has a question about. If you want to understand Rashi's commentary, you have to ask yourself, what is Rashi struggling with? Ma kasheh leRashi. So what's Rashi's beef here? On verse 2, it says, the last 5 words, Vayichan sham Yisrael neged ahar. And Israel, the people of Israel, the Jewish people, parked there facing the mountain. In Hebrew, unlike in English, if I parked my car and all of us parked our car, it's still the word parked for singular and plural. In Hebrew, like in French, like in Farsi, like in Arabic, if I parked or if we parked, it's a different word. If I parked, it's Vayichan. I parked. And that's what it says, Vayichan. If it's many people parked their cars, it should say Vayachanu. So Rashi says, why does it say Vayichan? Why it says Israel, the whole nation, as if one person set camp there. Rashi says something very beautiful. The Torah is telling us, this is Rashi, Ke'ish echad belev echad, as if we were one person with one unified heart. Another thing Rabbi Sachs was telling us here 3 weeks ago during his visit is that he remembers as a student in Cambridge the waiting period before the 6-Day War. 22 years after the Holocaust, Egypt and Syria said, we're going to drive the Jews into the sea. If there's another war, it's going to be a war of annihilation. And all over the world, people were freaking out. Sean Connery, the famous actor, Jean-Paul Sartre, the great French philosopher, they were all signing petitions, save Israel. Now the thing is, Jews in America were, all over the world, people were giving their lifelong savings that they may be allocated for their kids to go to college or a down payment for a mortgage. They were giving that. They were trying to save Israel. You know, people really thought Israel was going to be destroyed. My other grandfather, I have to reciprocate, my other grandfather of blessed memory was a Holocaust refugee. And most of his family, except one brother, was murdered in the Holocaust. His immediate family. And he really had the dread that this is going to happen now in Israel. And he told me when he heard on the radio that Israel is going to withstand the attack and survive the war, he burst out sobbing. Why am I telling you that story? Well, that reminding us of that piece of Jewish history about half a century ago, 53 years ago, because the Jewish people were super united before the 6-Day War. And that's just the law of humanity, right? United, we thrive. We don't just end, we thrive and we soar. Divided, forget about it, right? So, 3 times we went to exile. When the brothers betrayed Joseph, when King Solomon died and the 2 new kings couldn't get along, and then the 10 tribes were exiled, and then the other 2, we lost the first temple. And when the Romans destroyed the second temple, the moderates who were trying to reach an accommodation with the Romans were fighting civil war, killing each other with the extremists who wouldn't compromise with Rome. Imagine the Roman Empire is already besieging the walls of Jerusalem, and Jew is murdering Jew. So that's what happens when we're divided. All the great empires of the world, when they tried to defeat us and completely eradicate us, failed. But when we're divided, we destroy ourselves and we get exiled, right? It teaches us that there's only one group of people that can destroy the Jewish people, and that's the Jewish people. But when we are united as one person in one heart, we can achieve monumental things for the world and for humanity. And that's how we received the Torah. In total unity. What's the Hebrew word for one? Echad. What's the numerical value of the word echad, one? 13. Aleph is 1, Chet is 8, Daled is 4. 1 plus 8 plus 4 is 13. Okay? Ahava, love, is also 13. De'aga, concern, is also 13. So if you love someone and you're concerned about them, then you are as one. So this was the spiritual and national prerequisite. And Rashi also says all the other places where we set camp, we were fighting and we were complaining. Only there we were utterly unified. Now, verse 4, for the sake of time. Verse 4, on page 349, it says, Atem reitim asher asiti lemitzrayim. You saw how I, God, vanquished the greatest empire of the time, and I carried you on the wings of eagles and brought you to me. The wings of eagles is a beautiful allegory. And Rashi says, what's the difference between an eagle and all other birds? Very beautiful, Rashi. He says, other birds, when they fly, they are afraid that another bird will come, soar above them, and snatch their baby, their offspring, right? And take it away for dinner. So they put their baby bird on their back as they fly, on top of them. But an eagle, nobody soars higher than the eagles. That's why, right, we have this song, where the eagles fly on a mountain high, right? So an eagle holds their offspring with their claws, so to speak, beneath them. Because the only thing that an eagle is worried about is if a human being shoots an arrow. So the eagle says, well, if they hit, let them hit me and not my offspring. It's a beautiful idea. Now I want to tell you a very cute historical vignette. When Jews came to Israel from Yemen, actually the Yemenites came very early, like the Eastern Europeans, the early Zionists, but then there was a massive wave of immigration from Yemen after Israel came into being in the 50s. Early 50s, late 40s. And some of them were strict followers of Maimonides. Why is that? Because when Maimonides lived between 1135 and 1204, there was an Islamic fundamentalist group who said at some point to the Jews of Spain, of Morocco, of Yemen, you either convert to Islam or we execute you. And Maimonides wrote, the people of Yemen asked Maimonides, can we come back to Judaism? And Maimonides says, you betcha. Of course you can. You just paid lip service. You didn't really take it on in your heart. Right? It's like kids that you tell them, do you promise? And you can't see their feet because they're wearing shoes, so they're crossing their toes. Right? So you didn't really mean it. So the Yemenites felt very indebted to Maimonides, continued following him. And when did we prohibit polygamy? When did we decide that Jewish husbands can only have one boss? That was in the year 1000. Rabbeinu Gershom was an Ashkenazi European rabbi. So the Jews of Yemen didn't get word. They came to Israel and they had 2 wives. They could only register one with the Ministry of Interior. But what I want to tell you, I have a good friend who's a colleague, a rabbinic colleague on the East Coast in New York, who is a Yemenite Israeli. And he tells me, when my parents were coming to Israel, so beautiful, listen to this, they've never seen an airplane in their lives. And they see an engined bird waiting to take them to Israel. So they look at each other and say, that's it. God says, I'm going to take you on the wings of eagles. The Messiah's here. And here's the bird. Let's go sit inside the bird. Isn't that something? I think it's a beautiful story. Now, verse 5 has something very special. Now, if you listen to me, if you follow God's calling to live in spiritual and moral excellence, ushmartem et briti, keep my covenant. What is a covenant? It's a perpetual existential bond. We are together forever. Right? Unlike a legal contract that you can render null and void. Right? A business contract is a transaction. But a brit is a spiritual, perpetual, existential bond. But if you follow the way of my way, the way of God and Torah, then you will be for me as gula mikol ha'amim. You will have a unique spiritual vocation amongst the nations. You will be an am olam, an eternal people. Many nations throughout history will disappear with time, but you will remain, because your job will be to spread God's word. It's very beautiful. It says in the blessings we say after the Haftarah, the recitation of the prophetic portion, every Shabbat, whoever just read the Haftarah reads the blessing. It says that God promised King David and his lineage, and by extension the Jewish people, Shelo yichben nero l'olam va'ed, that our candle shall never be extinguished. Ha'im shamo tishmo. If you follow the way of God, then you will become a spiritually exemplary people. And remember, it's conditional. We have to do our part. If we want to shine, we have to earn it. Just like in the second paragraph of the Shema that we say in the morning and evening service, it says, Ve'haya im shamoa tishmeu. If you follow God's laws, V'item kdoshim le'elokechem, then you will be holy. It's not a priori. Nobody can just say, I was born to this and that family or this or that lineage. That makes me holy. No. You have to work for it. Right? A person can be the child of the greatest rabbi who ever lived. If they don't put in the work, they don't merit it. And similarly, we've seen people throughout history who came from parents who were completely not focused spiritually and morally, but they managed to break the glass ceiling and, achieve greatness. And really, verse 6 is the Jewish mission statement. It's a huge verse. V'atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim. You will be a kingdom of priests. Every Jew is a kohen. Every Jew is a priest. Every Jew is clergy. Every Jew is a rabbi. I want all of you to be leaders. I want you to be a nation of leaders. And a holy nation. What does it mean, holy? Distinct, distinguished. Carry yourself in a regal, exemplary fashion. I remember many years ago, a good friend of mine from London told me that he saw the late Shimon Peres. He was the world's greatest statesman when he passed away. Shimon Peres lived till the last day he worked. And he said, he was the only man who was both prime minister and president of Israel, and a global sage. He says, I saw Shimon Peres walking in the street. He said, he should have seen the way he walks. It was a sight to behold. He works, and his posture is so straight and regal and refined and yet humble at the same time. That's what it means, in a sense, to carry yourself in a distinguished way, not just externally, but mostly internally. That's what, says Moses, I want you to tell the Jewish people. I want you to be holy. I want them to be distinct and distinguished. I want them to be role models. Right? Okay. The fifth Torah portion for this Shabbat is verse 7 on page 359. And Moses 349, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that. And Moses came to the elders of the people. By the way, the elders mean the sages. Somebody could be relatively young, but a sage. But the elders is not necessarily in chronological age. And he reported to them, he sent them an email with everything that God told him. And all the people answered. And he says, everything that God said, we shall do. And remember, later on we're going to say, Na'aseh v'nishma. And we'll talk about it when we get to it, exactly what it means. The gist of it is basically that life breaks down to a series of concrete actions. Now I'm talking about the famous saying of Na'aseh v'nishma. It means we will do and then we will hear. What will we hear? The results. We can sit here and talk about tomorrow until tomorrow about how important it is to exercise and to be nutritiously conscious. But at the end of the day, it's just talk. If we exercise regularly and eat in a healthy fashion, we're going to hear it. We're going to feel it. We're going to be it fit. The same thing in spirituality, in morality, and intellectual learning. If you put in the work, you will hear the results in every fiber of your being. That's the idea of Na'aseh v'nishma. Right? We really know what we need to do every day. Right? We know how we need to communicate with other people. We know we should pray every day, 3 times a day. We know we should be saying the blessings before and after we drink. We know what we need to do. It's a transition from theory to practice that's very challenging. Like Stephen Covey says in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, it's an incredible work, this book. He says, I recommend the audio version, he says, the 7 habits are common sense, organized. But what is common sense is not always common practice. Right? We know what we need to do. The trick is to actually do it. That's the idea of Na'aseh v'nishma. In any event, now let's go to verse 9 on page 349. And God says to Moses, behold, I am approaching you. And Maimonides spent a lot of time explaining God. This is a spiritual, abstract teaching. God is abstract and spiritual, but Dibrat Torah Bilshon Bnei Adam. The Torah tells the story that even little kids could read. I'm coming to you in the thickness of the cloud. What does that mean, in the thickness of the cloud? It means that we could never have an unmediated encounter with God. Right? Just like the sun is millions of light years away. If the sun would permeate our world, we would all become French fries. So we can't. What we have in this world are extensions of the sun rays. Similarly, in this world, we have the power, vitality, the Shekhinah, God's presence in this world. I'm coming to you in the thickness of the cloud. Here comes something very, very beautiful. Fasten your seatbelts. Verse 9, the last 6 words say the following. Vayaged Moshe et divrei ha'am el Hashem. Moses reported to the people to God. Moses reported the words of the people to God. The Jewish people told Moses something, and Moses reported it to God. Rashi asks the question, what did the people tell Moses that he repeated to God? This is very beautiful. Rashi says what the people told Moses is this. It's not the same thing to hear something from the king's mouth than to hear it by way of emissary. Many years ago, the Tel Aviv basketball team won the European Championship, and there was a decisive game in Tel Aviv. There was 6 points down, 12 seconds to go. Thousands of people left the stadium to beat traffic. They hit 2 3-pointers and won in overtime. And people thought there was a volcanic eruption. There was an earthquake in Tel Aviv. Everybody jumped. And one of my brother was at the game. And his friend was already in the car, and he heard the whole place going nuts. He ran back. They didn't let him back into the stadium. Finally, he comes up to my brother. He's like, what happened? What happened? Now, my brother is telling him that they hit 2 3-pointers in the last 10 seconds, but he missed it. He heard about it, but he didn't see it. It's not the same thing to see something first and then to hear about it. The opposite, a terrible example, 9/11. Now we have bar and bat mitzvah kids. They were born after 9/11. For them, it's history. They didn't live through that terrible day. We saw it with our own eyes. It's engraved in us. So what the people are telling Moses is, we also want to have an encounter with the divine, like you. It's not the same thing. We love you, Moses, but you're like the FedEx UPS messenger. But we want to hear it from God's mouth. Retzonenu lirot et malkeinu. It is our utmost desire and will to behold the King. And for me, it's the most important thing in Jewish life. That, as we say in the last blessing of the Amidah, God has given us with His luminous countenance Torat Chaim, a Torah of life. You know, Shai Agnon was the greatest Hebrew writer in the 20th century. He won the Nobel Prize in 1966. And in one of his stories, he came from a town called Buchach that was decimated in the Holocaust. And he wrote about that town to immortalize it in text. And he has a story about a guy in his town who became secular. And one day he says he was passing by his house in Westwood, walking his dog, and he saw the guy studying Talmud, but not covering his head. And he told the guy, I was just wondering, I saw you studying Talmud through the window passing through your house, but I thought you no longer practice Judaism. He said, yeah, but I'm doing it for intellectual and cultural gratification. I enjoy the learning process. I'm doing it for the mind. So what this Rashi is telling us, the most important thing in Judaism is to have a lived experience, to have a relationship with God. That's the most important thing, right? That's what's going on here. Okay, verse 10, go to the people, have them send their clothes to the dry cleaners, because in 3 days' time, and they prepare themselves physically, hygienically, spiritually. And on verse 16, it says that the sound of a mighty shofar was heard, and everybody shuddered when they heard this shofar. And there is a rabbinic teaching, a symbolic teaching, that shofar is the same shofar that when Abraham, that too, it's also the shofar of the ultimate redemption, when humanity would finally repair itself. But also, allegorically speaking, it's the same shofar symbolically as the shofar that, when God taught humanity through Abraham that God covets not child sacrifice. Up until the binding of Isaac, the pagan civilizations, child sacrifice, infant sacrifice was rampant. And God tells them, don't do it. And then he tells them, there's a ram here with its horns stuck in the bushes. Right? And Abraham took the ram and brought it as an offering in lieu of Isaac. So they say, from that ram comes the shofar. So there are 3 monumental shofars. The shofar from Abraham, the shofar from receiving the Torah, and one day, please God, humanity will redeem itself. Now, here comes the 10 Commandments. The 6th aliyah is Shishi. Okay, it starts, let's go to verse 1. We don't have much time left. Verse 1, chapter 20. It's on page 353. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt from a house of bondage, from a house of slavery. You could say, so what? Because then we were exiled in Babylonia, and we were exiled all over the world for thousands of years. So God took us out of Egypt for a while. But then we were exiled and subjugated in countless other countries for countless centuries. So the thing is that God didn't only liberate us geopolitically, or even primarily. God primarily liberated us soulfully, existentially, spiritually, by giving us the Torah, giving us a GPS, a roadmap for life. That's the idea. That ultimate freedom is because we got out of Egypt in order to receive the Torah, a moral and spiritual compass. And another thing is that Rabbi Judah Halevi notices that here, when God is presented to the Jewish people, he is presented as the God of history, the God who intervenes in history to take out the Jewish people. In the beginning of the Torah, God is presented as the cosmological creator of the physical universe, the God of nature. Elohim, in gematria and numerology, is the same letters as the word Hateva, which means the nature. God, who is a transcendent being external to the universe, installs the laws of nature, photosynthesis, Newtonian laws of motion, and so forth. But here God is presented, there's this revolutionary to Jewish theology, the God of history. It's not only the God of nature that the despots and the dictators use to justify their rule. It's natural. I was chosen to be the ruler and you were chosen to be the slaves. That was the rationale of the ancient world. To this day there are tyrants like this in the world. But here God, in the words of our teacher Rabbi Sachs, this supremely powerful God liberates this supremely powerless, dehumanized, subjugated slaves. Right? So God intervenes in history. Ours is not the Aristotelian God, Aristotle's God, who is an unmoved mover who created the physical universe and then rented a nice suite in a fancy hotel in the French Riviera and put on the doorknob a sign, do not disturb. God is invested in our histories, as individuals, as nations, and as a species, Homo sapiens. So I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. And don't have other gods. Don't worship money. Don't worship what other people might think about you. Don't get too attached to physical things, right? That's the idea of the graven images and things like that, and that we should connect to God through meditation, not through statues or photos, right? We can train the mind and the heart to meditate on God's grandeur, right? Don't bow to anything. That's how Mordechai got into trouble in the Purim story, right? He wouldn't bow to Haman. Don't take God's name in vain. Remember to sanctify Shabbat, a day of soulfulness, and also a day in which everybody gets time to rest. The first 4 mitzvot are all about what I call the vertical relationship between us and God. Right? The next mitzvah, verse 12, on page 355, honor your father and mother so that your days will be prolonged. Right? It says in the Ethics of the Fathers, who is honored? The one who honors other. What does it mean to have length of days? Doesn't necessarily mean to live to 180. It means that people who get life right, spiritually and ethically, their days are full. They're full of joy, and they are full of great, impactful action. That's why it says in the Torah, and Abram was elderly, but he entered into his days with great enthusiasm, energy, action-oriented, and Abram blessed God with everything, which means that Abram also knew sorrow and heartache. To live a full life is to taste life in all its shapes. And then the next 5 commandments are the horizontal, interpersonal commandment. You shall not murder, not you shall not kill. So the worst translation in history. You shall not murder. If it were you shall not kill, it means that we should not have fought the Nazis in World War II. Right? No, we are allowed to defend ourselves. You shall not murder. Right? Now they parallel one another. I am the Lord your God, you shall not murder. The 20th century was the most atheistic century in history. Hitler, Stalin, Mao, atheistic regimes murdered hundreds of millions of people. Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist, says if God is dead, then everything is permitted. Right? So, I am the Lord your God at the top of the right tablet. Don't murder, the left tablet. The second commandment on the right tablet was faithfulness to God over other gods, false gods. Here it says faithfulness to one's spouse. You see the parallels? Don't steal, don't commit perjury in court. And the last commandment that I was asked to write a commentary on for the Jewish Journal this week, do not covet. Because that's destructive. People who become obsessive with physical, material things that other people have and they don't, first of all, they have a very skewed view on life. I'm reading this incredible book I want to recommend to you as we conclude the class called Positivity Bias. And it's about a positive attitude to life. And it's based on the life philosophy of the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe, Zchuto again Alenu, blessed and righteous memory. And people used to write him letters. He was like a spiritual therapist for hundreds of thousands of people. And somebody complained to him about his life. And this person was married and had kids. And the Rebbe wrote to him respectfully, do you know how blessed you are? Do you know that there are people who decades pray every day to find a life partner? Do you know that there are people like me, the Rebbe, who was childless? They couldn't have children? Do you even appreciate what you have? That's the idea of you shall not covet. You see, we are trained evolutionarily to focus on the negative. Like I'm wearing a white shirt. Imagine if I would spill the coffee and I'd have a little stain here. I would focus on the stain. That's what we do. And the Torah wants us to look at the big picture, right? Not only at the deficiencies that we feel that oftentimes are really, really. So, Positivity Bias, that's the name of the book. And I think his name is Kamelson, Kamelson. I'm not sure, but if you Google on Amazon Books positivity bias, or just write positivity bias books, you are not going to be able to miss it. Let me just conclude by saying what the Haftarah, the prophetic reading for this Shabbat, is taken from chapter 6 of Isaiah, the opening 13 verses. And why was this chosen as the prophetic reading for this Shabbat? We had an incredible revelation at Mount Sinai, the giving of the Ten Commandments. Here we have this incredible epiphany that the prophet Isaiah undergoes, where he says, Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzvaot, Meloch Cholatz Kodo, that we say during the repetition of the Amidah. Right? We say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. We stand in our sacred choreography at the edge of our toes. We're saying holy, distinct. God is beyond us, beyond the world, beyond time, beyond history, beyond human understanding. But also Meloch Chol Haaretz Kvodo. The entire world bespeaks, emanates, pervades God's presence, the power, vitality, which emanates every living entity in the world. So that's why it was chosen. Thank you for learning with us. Have a blessed rest of the week, and Shabbat Shalom.